Hey, this is Zach, and welcome back to the Writing Desk. Before we begin, I just want to encourage you that if you haven't done it already, you really should go listen to the prologue on either my Facebook or YouTube page. And if you enjoy this at all, consider subscribing to the YouTube or following me on Facebook so you know when new parts are uploaded. Here's Chapter 1 from A Song of the Isles, called Rooted in Tradition. I might never have fully understood the traditions of our people, but I've obeyed them as closely as I feel I'm capable. Still, never am I marked, and never do I reside in between loathing and half-given respect by the old ways. From the Journal of Findlay Ardifir. The door of Everett's home opened stiffly, and through it he dragged a long, thin cart laden with gifts. It was a good year for him, as the 50th birthday was one of true honor. It was when he would become a full adult Sith and would be marked among the elders of his township. Nothing much else had changed over the past few years. The last eventful time had been 24 years earlier, when new stories, made popular through long years and many retellings, marked a strange occasion in local history and culture. Everett smiled gleefully, having already invited his neighborhood to the festival, which by that point was 6 days off. Preparations were made, and gifts for both the high Sifs and the other yearlings were gathered on his wagon, which trudged through the fresh mud behind him as he turned onto the lane and headed west towards the next house. He arrived without much trouble, though his cart was somewhat shoddy, and a wheel did roll away once or twice over the half-mile that he had to drag it. The small forest road that led back to the Ardifir house came into view. The trees that had been bare of branches 24 years earlier had regrown wholly. They stretched across the pathway, and atop a particular sturdy one sat a young Sif in a pair of short pants with a finely made burgundy vest covering some of his black dress shirt. "Finished the outfit, did you? Trouble?" Everett smiled even wider, parting a few branches as he left the cart on the road. The young Sif looked somewhat sad, but as it was his property, he had every right to be so. "Rough day?" Everett added, allowing his full smile to diminish somewhat. "Rough week as always. But yeah, been a rough day," Findlay answered, looking up at Everett's face. Everett had gained half a dozen wrinkles across his blue-gray forehead, and while his face was closely shaven each morning, a few stray white hairs could be seen poking out of the corner on his jaw. His excitement had been clearly marked by his lack of attention when it came to his outfit as well, which was stained on the collar from a stray patch of mud from the walk over. "Well, you're welcome to wallow, as long as you're home, but you paint a smile on if you have to. You're to behave yourself better this year, you hear? And then when we come back in a few weeks, you can return to what you do best. You're Findlay Ardifir as long as we're gone. And maybe, if you behave yourself through the festival, you can be trouble again on the way home after all." Findlay flashed a half-hearted smile, but the falsity in it was as clear as day. He wasn't trying, not on his own land. "Never gotten some of these traditions, you know," Findlay complained. "It's not like people don't have problems, but showing them in public is like slapping someone across the face. We live our own lives. We solve our own problems. You grew up jumping between houses, so you got to see all kinds of other people's issues, but that's not usually the way." "We come together for community issues, though," Findlay objected. "No, we come together for community projects that need doing. If we didn't do them, then we'd have problems to go around. It's a simple way, I admit, but it's far easier to mind yourself and your family than it is to worry about everything outside your own home. We're solitary people most times, and if not for our love of stories, we might never talk at all beyond our own doors," Everett defended, and Findlay sighed. "Ugh, the stories. Not excited about hearing them this year? Thought you loved stories. I adore a good story. I just hate one in particular, and with my luck, it'll once again be the most popular. Even if I know how false it is by now. I've grown up hearing it change, and my family continues to look worse and worse with every year." "Well, your great-uncle does, certainly. People say he left the island and came back only to drag your grandfather into some awful business. No one's seen him since, so it's all guessing and embellishment, but you shouldn't mind it so much. Since it weren't how it happened, just think of it as a different story altogether. A fable, if you will." "Oh yeah, fable of Julius the Dull and Gardy the Drowned. Lovely story to consider. No, I think I'll just excuse myself when it's told, thank you." Everett sucked his teeth and shook his head. "Nah, I wouldn't do that, yearling. You'll be noticed. And there's not ruder than to walk out in the middle of a telling. You know that. Findlay sighed very deeply and with frustration. He raised his hands in surrender and slipped down from the branch. He turned to the door and stood still, waving to Everett over his shoulder. Everett headed off and did the same as he returned to his cart. "When are we setting off?" Findlay asked as he headed to his door, still waving. "Noon, or thereabouts. We've a long journey, my young lad, and we should toast to your birthday before we head out, since you're old enough to drink now. Meet me back at the Black Dragon fire, or you're ready, and we'll drain a glass together. Just remember, fake that smile if you must, Trouble." Findlay vanished behind the door, and he lay against it for a while until the sound of the wagon faded between the chirps of farbirds and the babble of the ale stream. He didn't move for a long while, and instead glanced around his small home. The trees that folded together into a sort of braided ceiling reminded him ever more of the stories that he'd heard through the years. His loathing only grew further. At length, he pulled himself away from the door, and it seemed a struggle to him. In dreamy but thick frustration, he drudged across the floor to his reclining chair, and there sat down and rested legs for a moment. He had a great deal to pack still, but didn't want to rise at that moment. He had traditions to consider, and thought more than ever that they served him on this particular day. He stretched and leaned forward, opening the ottoman and lifting the blankets from within. Beneath them, a false bottom lay, and he removed that as well with great care. In the bottom, he glanced around, speaking to himself as he did. Were he to exercise his habits in public, he would surely be mocked, but in the silence of his own home, his voice was still a comfort without judgment or insult. 25, he said quietly to himself, a hush overtaking his voice as if someone just might hear him. He looked all around the drawer, fidgeting with small trinkets as he did. He lifted a small satchel and moved it around in his hand, feeling the contents in a way that he'd never done before. He pulled the drawstring, and looking inside, he spied a number of small acorns, each stained by a long red vein that throbbed in the low candlelight. He put it in his pocket, not truly knowing what it was, but valuing it as the heirloom that he knew it to be. Beneath it, a long and hooked knife sat comfortably in its sheath. He pulled that out as well, removed the scabbard, and stared at the strange mirror shine on the blade. He'd never done this either, and for the first time he spied a stranger thing than his eyes had ever glanced. His reflection didn't show in the pure, sharp image along the blade. He could see the room behind him, and the flame of the candle on the wall was flickering quite clearly, but his bright eyes, reddish skin, and salt and pepper hair were entirely absent. As he continued to look at the edge and heft of the knife, more confusion ensued, and the trees forming the ceiling and walls behind him appeared to shift slightly in their place. They almost seemed to glow, if such a thing were possible, without casting light on anything around them. Outlined and illuminated by a sort of bright, wavy heartbeat, they wriggled and writhed in the corners of the peculiar reflection. As he turned it in his hand, he swore that another pair of eyes looked in on him, but as he was already disturbed, this served only to make him drop the knife, watching closely as it struck the hard ground. It rang, high and hollow. It was a sharp sound that ached to hear and chimed for much longer than any other metal he'd ever heard. He immediately sheathed it, and it rang as he raised it up until the very moment that it was encapsulated in the thick hide of the home it held for a quarter century. The ringing died in a short time thereafter, and he felt convinced it would continue if he drew it again. Anxiously, he tucked it inside and reached back into the bottom of the ottoman. It was only then, with his attention keen and his eyes quite focused, that he saw a small sliver removed from the very bottom of the space. He dug his foreclaw into it and pried it upward. The small plank released, and a plume of dust danced into the air and forced a harsh cough from him. Tucked beneath it was a small bundle of velvet and silk, a drawstring made of what looked like solid silver wrapped about the neck of the satchel. He pulled it high and held it in his hand, but dared not to even glance within, lest he was assailed again by the fear and surprise that the odd knife had brought to him. Those presents, those heirlooms which marked him as one of his kin, were to be given to the Sith elders. Other gifts, trinkets, and handcrafted things were to go to the other gearlings, young and old. He'd already assembled those. When he'd packed his other belongings, he hoisted his very large rucksack onto his back, and on either shoulder he hung similarly sized bags stuffed to the neck with gifts of all kinds. He'd had all that he would need for his journey, if it blessedly lasted only the 5 days that were expected. But between his cookpot and bedroll and many sets of clothing, he was already feeling the strain, even before he'd left his door. He groaned, frustrated after a few steps through the door, remembering that his face was not yet shaven or painted, and thusly he returned to tidy himself up before heading to the inn to meet the others who he would travel alongside. He trimmed the stubble that had formed on his chin, scraping down so closely that were he an unsteady hand, he might have no chin left at all. He braided his hair and dropped it onto the center of his back, then moved to painting wide columns of white from his forehead, over each eye, and down to where his jaw met his neck. To either side of his eyes he painted his family sigil, a small swirl, starting at the thickest at the top and thinning as it went round until a thin tail lined up just underneath the thickest point. Staring at himself in the looking-glass, he wondered if he'd done it correctly. He wondered if this was how his family had done it before leaving him as the last of his line. He realized quickly that it mattered not, and his future was his own to forge. He silently cursed the reputation that the men of 2 generations before his own had marked him so sorely, but he had hoped that he could reverse that ill fortune. He returned the bag to his shoulders and walked through his door. He took a deep breath and gave a far more convincing smile than he had earlier, and that remained with him as he walked down the lane. It was a dull trip from there for him, despite the many chirping birds and beautiful landscapes that spanned as far as the eye could see. He was distracted, and his eyes looked ever downward. He wasn't a mopey Sif, and seldom did he act like this. He'd gained his nickname of Trouble for the various antics that he and his friends would usually get up to, while others were distracted or busy. The only one who seemed to know enough to name him for it, though, was Everett, who'd taken him under his wing and protected him fiercely against rumors and sour looks from the townsfolk of Minhir. For a while, he walked along the lane and gathered his thoughts into tiny bundles. He knew that right from the moment that he first entered the tavern to the moment that he returned home, he'd hear his most loathed story again and again. Without really meaning to, he'd started to grasp at the things in his pocket, and had wrapped his hand around the small satchel of acorns. He crinkled them against one another through their leather sheath, and the sound was somehow comforting to him in a dull, confusing way. He released the satchel, and his hand moved through his exceedingly deep pocket, grasping for any purchase in an anxious attempt for further, unexpected, but sorely desired solace. His hand wrapped around the sheath of the knife, whose handle was jutting upward from his pocket, and he felt his mind drift back to the memory of the strange reflection that he'd only just seen on its polished face. Somehow the memory seemed distant and blurred, as if the thought itself wanted to be forgotten. He mocked himself silently as he considered how silly that sounded, then voiced his thoughts quietly and in a mutter. A memory that wants to be forgotten? You're losing your mind, Ardifir. He couldn't help but have his smile ring truer as he laughed at his own odd thoughts. He might have been a different sort of Sif, but the usual thoughts still entered his mind here and there. Others saw him as strange almost exclusively, and he couldn't always deny it wholeheartedly. He pulled the knife up from its sheath and glanced at the blade once more, turning it in his hand and feeling a pleasant warmth surging up his arm, based in his long fingertips. Suddenly, and certainly beyond his expectation or desire, he felt an attachment to the knife. He muttered as he turned it in his hand further, glancing at the strange appearance of the trees within it and marveling at his lack of reflection in the blade. The elders don't need 3 gifts after all. His voice was hushed and careful. I mean, it's mine after all, isn't it? I can decide what I give them, and there's no call to give them everything that marks me as an Ardifir by more than just name. He defended himself against the voices in his mind. Truthfully, they didn't feel like his own voice. They felt more akin to the voices of the young elders from around town, or the adults who were only a generation ahead of him. As he was entering young adulthood himself, he had no quarrel with claiming the knife as wholly his own, but battled against the voices of those in later stages of life who'd been so very critical of him. No one would begrudge me this. Surely not. He shook his head vehemently and smirked honestly. The thought of owning such a unique treasure was alluring beyond his want to belong, and in that, his mind was made up. He slid the knife back into its sheath and hooked said sheath to the loop of his belt on the left side. It hung there, dangling down against his thigh and tapping on his breeches as he walked. Having looked hard for solace in the silliest of places, he'd certainly been rewarded. A hand in the pocket seems an unlikely course for support and joy, but there it was, an exuberance that he'd not expected to feel through that entire week, and it was refreshed by the tapping on his hip. Findlay reached the crossroads of Minhir about 20 minutes later, and there he turned aside to enter a small shop on the side of the road. It took him a moment to remember himself and his proper behavior, and gave a wave to the shopkeeper who returned it gleefully. Findlay lowered his bags beside the door and pointed to them with his right hand, raising 3 fingers with his left. The shop owner nodded and reached out to shake his hand. After the shake, the shopkeeper went about his business while Findlay glanced over the wares on the far wall. He had a unique purpose for being there and had not yet decided whether or not it was a good idea. His plan was to ask the craftsman if he had any inklings as to the nature of his knife. Being the only toolsmith in Minhir, he'd be the one to ask, though the fact that it had once been owned by the now infamous Julius Ardifir was cause for keen thought before asking such a question. Secondarily, Findlay had already sent word ahead to the elder Sif, and had told them the count of his gifts to ensure that it was enough. While one would have been plenty, or so they said, they now expected 3, and while it would have been a grave insult to give them anything other than a family heirloom, there would be no way for them to know the difference. Or so Findlay reasoned, at least. In the end, he slipped into the corner and inspected the sheath of his newest possession. It was old, almost brittle hide, and was well beyond worn down. It was cracked, missing pieces in a few places, and thusly was worth very little. There was nothing apparently special about it, and Findlay came to a sudden conclusion which brought him great joy. It would be no lie that the sheath itself was an heirloom, and would count as such in their eyes, but the knife certainly didn't have to be one. With a wide smile, Findlay found a similarly sized knife with a much finer and newer sheath, and purchased them before leaving the shop. He swapped the sheaths and put his own knife into the newer sheath on his waist, placing the other in his bag as he headed off towards the inn to meet his friends. It was nearing noon already when Findlay came to the center of the crossroads. The 3 lanes met at a low point where a pond had formed, fed by a thin brook that split away from the ale stream and drained away into 2 smaller tributaries, which wound away like snakes into the lowlands between the hills. For miles beyond to the west, open fields and farmlands stretched far and grew high. Wheat, barley, and many other grains grew fast and strong, and danced in the whipping winds over the plain. Findlay approached the inn and set his packs beside the door. It was a tall building, built between 2 smaller hillocks with walls pinched between them. Its shape was thinner at the base and much wider on the upper floors, and thusly only a single stairway was built on ground level. With the door opened, Findlay entered and climbed the stairs. The building opened up into a wide circular room on the first floor. The second floor was nearly 3 times the size and was home to the many beds and private booths that could be rented for rest or special occasions. The tavern floor was nice enough, though. A pair of twin hearths were set into the wall at the back, and in the center was a row of wide, round tables, most of which were full of patrons drinking the last celebration before they would make the long journey to a lemoir. Voice came from the left side of the room, where the bar was full already of half-drunken Sif who likely drank their weight in wine during the morning. Though it might seem strange to many, Sif drank more commonly in early hours, when their energy was full and the likelihood of falling asleep in a stupor was much lesser. This was one thing that Findlay did at least understand, unlike a great many traditions and customs among their people which seemed odd. To fall asleep drunk in a public place was heavily frowned upon, and while that part was still an oddity, considering how much they drank, the loose rule of heavy drinking in the morning and on celebratory occasions, and nursing the buzz through the afternoon, seemed perfectly fair to him. An arm waved at him from the right hearth, where a small, leather-cushioned booth housed 6 Sif of varying ages and sizes. There was Everett, who was the owner of the flailing arm held above the backboard of the couch. There was Swain Windsor and Elise Flick, 2 of Findlay's close companions and very good friends, even as far as Sif relationships went, which were very often closely knit. On the other side of the couch were 3 others, and while they were familiar to Findlay, they certainly weren't as close friends as the others. Marcus Flick was Elise's far older brother, and with him were his 2 closest cohorts, Z.D.L and Esser Sycamore. Elise and Swain had come down from the northern row of Minhir, and were preparing to join their own small parties for the journey to the festival. "Get over here, lad. We got a pint for you." Everett beckoned, his voice wide and warm with the embrace of 2 hours' worth of drink. Findlay approached and jumped over the back of the couch, falling between Swain and Elise and wriggling until he was comfortably squeezed between them. Everett handed him a large flagon full to the brim with strangely thin red liquid, only visible where it slightly overflowed and dribbled down the sides. A foamy head of bright pinkish bubbles erupted from the hissing cup, and a sound extremely near to sizzling came from the top. Everyone raised their own cups and held them high, signaling to the barmaid for a refill. Findlay waited for her to approach and waited with interest as Swain eyed the buxom Sif who swaggered over to answer the call for fresh drink. She was almost in costume, wearing a frilled frock and a very wide skirt which sat almost a full foot outward from either ankle as it tickled at the dusty floor. She poured from a large glass pitcher filled to the brim with the same translucent red liquid as was in Findlay's own flagon. From a great height she poured, and a thin waterfall of red babbled down into the half-filled glass until they each had a head to match. "Just call if you need more here," Sandra Cordry said as she swung her hips and almost danced back to the bar. Swain's skin went slightly yellower and redder than it had been. The typical gray of his skin was soon much more colorful, though he tried to hide it behind his flagon as he raised it for a toast. "To our youngest of yearlings, who this year becomes an honored young sif, to Master Findlay Ardifir." Everyone else clacked their flagons together, then drained them over varying spans of time. Findlay himself was somewhat hesitant to try and swallow the contents in one go, but after a nudge from Elise, he attempted and proved equal to the task. "So we got a drinker after all." Swain smiled wide and true, and seemed to think for a moment about where to go next with his comment. He seemed a faster thinker overall, and while his considerations over what to say and how to say it were very frequent, he proved his agile mind by pausing for less than a second each time. "You got your presents and all?" he asked. Findlay nodded, pumping his closed fist against his chest with the thumb tucked under to relieve the pressure that so many bubbles had made there. "3, as it were," Findlay confirmed, and Everett nodded proudly. "You'll make an impact there. Not often the one so young gives so much on his generation day. And there it is. Pardon, have you thought about what you're to do about that?" Everett asked, and his meaning was taken, but still gained a choking cough from Findlay. "That is, about family. You got a girlie you might be looking at?" Findlay glanced around in an awkward panic as the others took joy from his embarrassment. Swain once again glanced at Sandra, and though it wasn't his time to comment, his eyes spoke volumes. Had it been less rude to deflect a serious question, Findlay might have done just that, but with one so much older asking a question of consequence, Findlay was cornered well and good. No mind for family just yet," Findlay admitted painfully. Elise chuckled at him mockingly. "Never did have much of an eye for girls, did you?" Findlay looked harshly at her, but his smile remained. Still, the daggers in his eyes were warning enough, and she retreated from her insult pincer. "I've had bigger things to worry about, and who but you would expect me to start looking well before my time?" Findlay said pointedly as he looked towards Elise. Just japing," she defended, and her smile widened. "Any new tales to tell?" Marcus asked, deflecting the subject on behalf of Findlay, who thankfully sighed at him and gave a thorough nod. "In time for a proper tale this morn," Everett complained, and his tone was almost frustrated. "We gotta be off early. Findlay might have a good horse to ride, but us others will need to ride the wagon on our way. Never did get how you wrangled that pony, but nah." Everett gave a wave of his hand. "I know you never tell this old sif your secrets." Swain glanced over at Findlay, who was smiling and nodding. Truthfully, it wasn't much of a tale at all, and certainly no secret as far as he thought. He'd simply found the young thing hobbling through the thicket on a midsummer morning a few years earlier, and as it was early in the season and his planting and gardening were all well tended by then, he had little to do. Nursing the little thing back to health was no great chore for him, as it was a welcome distraction after that gravest of festivals earlier in the year. If ever there was a time when Findlay didn't want to hear stories in his life, it was for the 3 months after his 20th festival. That was the year that the nicknames were attributed to his family, and with them came a certain unwelcome reputation for ill dealings and foul behavior. In his judgment, there was no better way to curb it than to prove himself as a capable animal handler and a skilled gardener. He'd been quite wrong on that, though, as no one seemed to notice how much time and care he gave his young horse, or how bright and well-tended his garden had been that year. A lesson was learned well that season, that if a family runs your name into the mud, it's no small thing to undo it. It had taken him years already to prove he wasn't just some miscreant, and would likely be further years before he proved himself worthy in anyone's eyes who hadn't played a major role in raising him. "You know the whole story, Everett," Findlay argued merrily. "It's barely a story at all. I raised him. Simple as that." "You must have been lucky or skilled and something to find an animal who'd behave so well without rearing and all that business. I mean, how do you know what to feed him, how to teach him? Never mind. We've no time after all. We'll be off before we even had a chance to have lunch. I'm thinking we should head out now, the thought's fresh. Wouldn't want to be too late in arriving in the next town. We don't want to sleep on wagon wheels, do we?" "Perish the thought, sleeping 'neath the stars," Findlay joked. "What's the harm in it?"
The harm's that we've business along the way, Trouble. We don't want to go venturing by night across fields and plains. You know, those folk mistrust those who move in darkness. We don't want the hounds on us, nor do we? Elise and Swain traded furtive but concerned glances. Findlay acknowledged that being hunted down by the farming dogs would be an unwelcome yearling present, and that at least was received mirthfully. But regardless, they all rose and prepared to take their leave. Marcus and his companions stood up out of respect to wish them off.
"Safe travels all. Don't get into any trouble you can avoid, sweet sister,"
he mocked, his tone rioting in a suspicious tone. "Don't you fall further into form that egg-shaped head of yours, big brother," she rebuked, sticking her tongue out childishly as she waved. In public gatherings, family were the only ones to share insults openly as jokes. It was seldom taken well to playfully mock one another, though serious critique was somehow taken in stride in silence most times. The moment she was done waving, she turned and left. Findlay, as was common around that time each year, waved as he walked away, and everyone understood why among their group, though others wondered rather loudly over it. He hurriedly exited as the stories about his family began, vacating the inn and sighing deeply. He'd only just avoided a very long-winded retelling about his great-uncle's many supposed blunders. He moved over to the stable, and there he spied that his horse, a great auburn beast with a mighty mane of crimson, had already come to meet him. Much as if the creature could already read Findlay's desires and thoughts, he'd come unbidden, and just beside the stable he whinnied and stamped excitedly for his master's arrival. With no inkling of how long his mount had been waiting, Findlay approached and pulled a wide, many-bristled brush from his rucksack. He ran it through the crimson mane, clicking with his tongue and teeth to settle the nerves of what was likely the closest living thing to him. There, Nim," he comforted, and in his voice was a hearty song. With great pleasure and comfort for both involved, the brush ran through each tangle and split them into straightened strands. Nim stopped his stamping and lowered his proud head, his backwards curling horns catching the noontime light and sparkling. They were like onyx or obsidian and were smooth as such. Their curvature moved up and back along the top of his head, near the end curled back on themselves to a point, forward and flattening edges like very sharp knives. Along his dappled amber coat were flecks and weaving patches of deep black. Smudged with coal he appeared to be, and here and there along his joints ruby scales seemed to appear round the rings of longer red hair. His saddle was made masterfully. It was 3 months of hard work in Findlay's home before the artful crafting of that saddle had been completed, and during that time he'd been sorely missed by his friends and acquaintances. He'd not left his den save for when Nim needed food, but by that time Nim would often graze along the river of his own accord. He was a wild soul, and craved the open fields beyond Minhir. Though for a ride and with nothing more than desire on his master's part, Nim would return with haste. From behind them the others approached, and for a while they did not dare disturb the brushing that was so careful and full of joy and loving connection. Swain, Everett, and Elise all stood behind the corner of the building's face and spoke amongst themselves. They muttered small words over the strangeness between Findlay and his beloved Nim, as even among the walkers of the Great Plains such a bond was unheard of. "Now that's the story I want," Everett admitted as he watched on. Findlay moved his hands into the smooth and feathery mane, and there entangled his fingers between the hair. He patted at Nim's spine and comforted him until all of the huffing breaths had faded. It was only then that Swain seemed to notice the peculiar knife sitting on Findlay's waist. He said nothing, as it was likely to be dismissed if he mentioned it publicly. Despite their usual way of being open and truthful when things were asked, Swain knew well that Findlay was different, quite secretive when he had a mind to be. He judged that it would only serve to ask over a drink near to nightfall or when the riding had begun, and the wear of day was thicker laden on their shoulders. Such wear was useful oil to loosen the tongue of Findlay, who could be knotted and tied deep behind his teeth when he was thoughtful. Findlay attached his bags to the saddle's side, where 2 long hooks rose upward from either side. Nim didn't seem to notice the great weight that had been thrust onto him. The Sif, to their credit, might have been thin and slight of build, but they were strong as any man. Indeed, they were likely stronger. Still, Nim was a horse, or so was thought, of very special breeding, if indeed he was a horse at all. In fact, such rumors had often been spread about him when he galloped and cantered across the plains. Among the mustangs and other wild beasts, he was quite unique. Even when he felt the desire to tread among the Minhirian, for which he'd been named, he was a golden statue amid mannequins and scarecrows. Minhirian, known for their wild ways and soft, luminous coats, were rarely ridden and never tamed. Their vibrant hues of white, gold, and sometimes red shone in the sun like jewels from far away. Still, they had no horns, and seemed to behave as regular horses do, if wilder and more intelligent in the manners and patterns of other creatures. They avoided contact with living things, and while they seemed to lead a host of other creatures on safe paths through the wild, they were very rarely seen by the eyes of Sif. A legend they were, and doubted wholly by most, while others would claim to have seen them for the renown it might generate. If Minhirian he was their sire or their king. That much seemed clear to those who saw fit to bar doubt from their hearts. But the Minhirian were not native to the Isle of Song, and there came the trouble with such thoughts. They were said to be from across the Northwash, and there they may roam in large herds across the gaps between thick forests, and across plains as wide and as far as any eye could hope to see in a month's travel on foot. But as for knowledge of that fact, it was unheard of. The Sif had only a few tales from beyond the sea, and currents that held them to their home, while holding others away even firmer. Nim lowered his neck and bent his front legs to allow Findlay to mount him, and Findlay did so, slipping into the large black leather saddle that had been so painstakingly made and fitted for Nim's back. It was comfortable, more comfortable than any chair, if Findlay's judgment was to be marked, and more at home did he feel in it than anywhere else in the world. The others began loading boxes onto a wagon. At length, they emptied their carts of the many presents that they all agreed to bring, and as they were a generous sort, there was a plethora of them. Everything from local wines to confectionaries. Dried meats and trinkets were there, as well as were spices and rare salts, bitters, and aged alcohols. Finally, the last box was loaded, and in this was contained both a present and a convenience for the road when travel became weary. It was a box of taggard's leaf, usually called red fog, a rarity even where it was most plentiful. It was expensive too, as it could only be grown for 1 day each month, and then only 2 months each year. It lasted long when dried, but all knew that the freshest leaves were the most potent, and with their chewing came a pleasant euphoria that couldn't be doubted or compared against. The aged leaves were smoked, and in that much more was expended for the same feeling, though among the Sif it was a true treasure. Its lesser, blue fog, was an all-year-round comfort, and could be grown more easily and with great plenty. Still, there was little comparison to be made between them. Taggard leaf would melt away the stresses of the world, would spare any Sif from pain and numb their mind to worry. It was a communion with the earth and wind beyond the words that many would use to try and describe it. Braggard's leaf was lesser in every way. It was a pleasant diversion, there was no doubt, but often overused and was easy to get used to. Its effect was still substantial, but it was an energetic, almost jittery feeling, and while it was wholly pleasant, it was nothing next to its better. Findlay, atop his mount, moved to the area patiently as he waited for the others. Even after they'd moved their luggage, they needed to tie it down and secure it. Across the hillside and the many rocky crags, they'd face some harsh roads, and to lose any of their gifts would be a great tragedy, as gifts were warned of ahead and were expected. It would be ill-received if one expected such a gift as they were promised and received nothing. Sif, while they may have been many things, did not forgive such breaches easily. When they'd finished, their large wagon was covered by a thick layer of cloth backed by dark leather to stave away wind and rain. The wagon was dragged by 2 healthy-looking draft horses named Wanderer and Wisp, and were keen to get moving. Anxiously, they padded about the ground with shoed hooves, and ever did their harsh breaths blow against the grass near their faces. Nim approached them on his own and seemed to whisper to them closely and without sound. Their breaths were calmed quickly, as if some great wind had blown through them and carried off their malcontent. Findlay patted Nim's back in approval, and while this packing was still ongoing, Nim remained there as a calming presence, nudging and breathing against their faces. His very breath seemed a drug that they couldn't refuse, and all of their negative feelings were drowned in it. It was past 1 when they'd finished, and with their cart ready, they climbed among the luggage, blankets, and pillows about them as they sat, while Everett took his place in the front of the wagon. He gathered the reins in his hands and snapped them, just as Nim moved aside to clear the road. At last they'd set off, and as the black dragonfly faded into the distance behind them and the warm winds blew, they felt ready for their travels. Swain gathered up 4 bottles of willow flower wine. He passed 2 to Everett and 1 to Elise. Everett leaned aside and passed one of them to Findlay, and all opened their bottles to have a swig as a marking for their first steps of their journey. It was sweet and smelled quite floral. Hints of the smells of lavender and loganberries wafted across the winds between them, and pleasantly they drank on. It was a very well-aged brew, a kind of red wine spiced and batched a quarter century earlier, and its value increased each minute of each day since last those flowers were picked. The sapling that had been planted to replace the fallen tree was only just beginning to blossom for the first time, but for many years yet it would be too immature to produce what was needed to make more.
And that ends chapter 1. Feel free to skip from here, but I'd just like to share a little something from myself to give you an idea of what I'm going for with this whole thing. I love to observe culture, and even more than that, I've realized that I adore creating it. There's something about making a tradition and watching how it affects different individuals in my story that really fascinates me. It makes them feel really alive. A lot of the story as a whole is dedicated to culture and personal growth through struggles that feel much larger than a singular character. From Findlay's perspective, that'll come through, I hope, in a big way. And one of the things that I'm majorly going for is that I want my world to feel alive, so that it's not just you're getting this small scope in the story through a tiny lens that doesn't give you a grander idea or a grander sort of feeling of a world, where it's just this small tidbit. But I am focusing on one pretty direct story through this, even though it does ebb and flow between different cultures and different characters at times. At any rate, I appreciate you listening to this, and I hope you're enjoying it. Have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you in the next one. Thanks.